Hey everyone, it's the Knitty Professor. What better time than the present to address the connections between knitting, fiber art, and the First Amendment, and in particular, freedom of speech, but also other freedoms that are addressed there. While I'm kind of talking over some points related to this topic, I'm going to be knitting on this scarf, which I've been working on for a good while. And some of you want to know what the yarn is. It's from a company called Interlacements, and this color is called, I say Ephraim, but I suppose in German it would be Ephraim, and it is 100% BFL. Hand dyed by Tracy Shute. So let's get into it. So I basically want to cover some connections, and at some point I might want to dig deeper into some of these, but it's just sort of exploratory discussion that I thought I would, it just seems timely, right? And it also is something that comes up, particularly in book 2 of my novels where I have a yarn bomber, and I'm sure it'll come up again because it just seems like its relevance never ceases. So let's consider the first point of fine art as protected speech. So art as speech, fiber art, I should say, as protected speech. And in some circles, well, art is expressive. It's like expressive conduct, expressive speech. It's not necessarily like, it differs a little bit from, just like talking or being a journalist or that kind of thing. It can be symbolic. There is such a thing as political knitting. We all know that, and we've all looked at the whole melt the ice hat, which a lot of us are knitting. I got my yarn, I got my pattern. I'm gonna hopefully get started on that soon. I also think about, and I've mentioned this before in my podcast, so my brother went through the whole AIDS epidemic in Atlanta, and he had a roommate who was actually a drag queen, and Brad died of AIDS. In my family, we often marvel over the fact that my brother didn't get it, being gay in Atlanta in the 90s and the club scene and everything, but he didn't, but he certainly had friends. So in any case, he made quilts for the whole the AIDS memorial quilt, the Names Project. And, that's a form of political fiber crafting. It's something I should probably explore more. There are also like historically anti-war type fiber art, scarves, badges, Hey Ari, what's going on? I think he misses his friend Summer. He also just ate, so he's probably a little whiny because he's tired. Hey, what's going on? He's exercising his free speech, by the way. Ari! We'll see what happens. Come up here. What you doing? Huh? Here. You need your toy. We'll see if he falls asleep. Might luck out, might not. Nonverbal expression is something that is recognized as being protected under the First Amendment. And I think of armbands. Obviously, watch It's Wonderful Life, and you see the armbands that people wear just to express grief. There are a lot of forms of speech that we make with our clothing. So visual art, and a lot of it's just commodified. In any case, it's all protected, So you can ask the question, at what point does craft become speech, and what's the line between craft and art? It's a really interesting, it also has to do with, women as makers, right? Because women weren't always deemed capable of art, right? Now, if we look at another right that is covered in the First Amendment, that's the right to gather, peaceful gatherings, and that also covers knitting circles, fiber guilds, and certainly fiber guilds are a big arena of a debate in my novels. In fact, one of my favorite scenes is when I go into the social versus medical model of disability and people are expressing their opinions. But gatherings, are protected, and they certainly apply to fiber, quilting bees, sewing bees, knitting, fiber guilds, all that kind of stuff. And they're often a place where women in particular exchange ideas. That's, I think slowly changing. More and more fiber gatherings are quite diverse, even as far as gender is concerned. But, historically, women I've read a lot of novels from the 19th century in Germany where the women were always portrayed as big gossips, and like whatever was happening, the women would find out about it at the quilting bee. Or at the spinning bee, more often, what they called the Spinnstube. So it was a news travels fast kind of event. And, some people might consider guild meetings and that kind of thing as maybe less, maybe more like quiet, culturally a little bit more quiet than, say, a town hall or something where political opinions are solicited for the public good, the communal good, like in the town or the county or whatever. But on the other hand, they can be very potent civic spaces and places where ideas can be exchanged and things can happen. One of the individuals who posted on my recent video about the Mount-Lies hat was one of the women who made the pattern. And she kind of expressed that it came out of, a knitting gathering. And they've raised a lot of money. And thank you all for buying the pattern. A lot of money on behalf of immigrant causes. So that's really cool. So stitching is gathering. It's protected. It definitely applies to our First Amendment rights and how we're exercising those. And it feels good to kind of acknowledge that. There is something about knitting in public that feels maybe less, maybe like threatening or in your face than a protest, for example. But, it's still covered. So, some of you, when I've made previous videos, you've alerted me to Craftivism, and I've looked into that. It's really interesting. And let's just acknowledge that, hey, as an important point that fits under this topic. Now, I want to read about the Craftivist movement. I do have a couple of books, and I haven't had time. I'm finishing my last paper for my TVI credential, Teachers of the Visually Impaired, and as soon as I'm done with that, I'm going to have a little more time. But yarn bombing, so that comes up explicitly in book 2 of my novel. Some of you have already read that, so you know what I'm talking about. And there's this whole line of protected speech that can border on vandalism. So where does yarn bombing end and vandalism begin? And that's definitely a point that is raised. It's like centered in book 2. And it becomes a rationale that could endanger the protagonist's opportunity to stay and keep doing his art in the United States. So yeah, I want to look into that in greater detail. If you have some resources you can recommend to me, I would love to know about that. Religion comes into play too. Definitely fiber arts are a part of religion. Hey, Ari, what are you doing? Do you need another toy? You're making a lot of racket, buddy. You should lie down. I should get him back up in bed. He's like just heavy enough, but also just small enough to where he struggles to get up here himself. Do you want me to get you up here? I could get you up here. In any case, one of the crafts that I participated in way back when I was in the Episcopal Church was needle pointing kneelers, kneeling cushions. And, of course, there are a lot of banners in churches up front, maybe something related to Pentecost or something related to Easter or something related to, whatever values. Yeah, thanks for knocking over my stand there, Ari. Are espoused by the church. So, fiber and religion, those are just examples from my experience, but, there are clothing that go together with certain religions. And, hey, Ari, I'm going to see if I can get over here. Do you want to come up here? Ari? May have to interrupt myself. We'll see. In any case, clothing related to certain religions. I mean, obvious example is, the conservative Mennonites, Amish, the Hutterites, and their clothing is an overt expression of their religious identity. So obviously, in that regard, fiber and clothing and its connection to religion is protected. It's protected by the First Amendment. So that's, it's kind of a cool deal to consider how fiber and religious freedom go together. You may have even more interesting examples than I do about like headwear or, I don't know, things that I haven't thought of. So here's another point that we can raise which is kind of related to the whole fiber guild question, and that's the idea of the domestic sphere as kind of a political space. So by relegating fiber art historically as women's work, it's a way to sort of erase some of its potential as a active player in the political conversation, shall we say, because, for a long time women didn't have a vote, and gosh, in places like Switzerland, they didn't even have the vote until like 50 years ago, which is crazy to think about. Knitting has been framed as women's work, and yet whenever it's been invoked at time of war for wartime production, or like mutual aid, knitting, socks for your husband who was a soldier or whatever, brother, uncle, and in like resistance economies, knitting, crafting, quilting, sewing have always been kind of sort of an element of political, quote unquote speech, or a political act that was undertaken in service of the military aims of certain countries. So that's kind of interesting to think about. And there's nothing about the First Amendment that says this only pertains to like what I'm doing now, speaking, or maybe chanting or singing, or written, words. It can apply to anything that can be construed as expressive. So that's something that is worth thinking about when we're talking about, like say, well, I've seen some really cool fiber art quilts that are very political in their expression. There's one that's probably not there anymore, but it was a quilt that celebrated voting rights in the airport in Minneapolis. And a year or so ago, when I was going through there on my way to Scandinavia, where I probably got this shirt, it's from Copenhagen, it was a really cool quilt. Unfortunately, I can't remember the artist, but it was very long. It was covered, I want to say, maybe about 30 yards of a wall. It was behind a glass case. And yeah, it sort of went over the history of voting rights in quilted form. It was really cool. I really liked it. So, it wasn't necessarily traditional art, it was born of the history of women's art and of sort of the quiet, private type of political speech, but there it was in a very public place, celebrated, and an awesome example of fiber art with a very political message. And, there are times when the line between private craft and public statement can be sort of unintentionally crossed. I mean, here I am knitting a rainbow scarf. Now, this is intentional, right? So I definitely am an advocate of rainbows in the symbolism of LGBTQA, etc. But, some people, maybe they're just going along, doing their own at-home kind of art, and then it can sort of turn into a political statement without their necessarily having anticipated that. One of the intersections that I explore a lot in my novels is that between disability and fiber art, because I have a blind knitter. So, as far as agency, I talk about agency a lot, because disabled people have their agency threatened at every turn, because things are just made for able-bodied people. And it's interesting to think about maybe even, as far as my blind protagonist is concerned, she's a multisensory artist, and she uses non-visual aspects of fiber art creation, specifically murals, to convey messages. For example, you could, I'm just going to speculate here because I don't want to give too much away about my book, but let's say you want to send an environmental message and you have a mural that's a fiber mural that is about a landscape, and you use the fiber to create certain textures that might express whether the land is fertile or not, or whether the land has been, stripped or somehow had its resources taken away or something like that. You could do something really cool, even non-visually, with texture to convey stuff like that. So it's really fun to think about the expressive dimensions of fiber art, because they, in some cases, go beyond what's possible with, say, mere painting. Dare I say, mere painting. I mean, painting is a visual medium. It's incredible. But fiber is something that we should be feeling. So if it's fiber art, we definitely, we're going to wear something like this, we're going to feel it. But it's really fun to explore the expressive potential of fiber art as something that is explored non-visually. And that leads to sort of a broader question of whose modes of expression count as speech. So is tactile art, does that count as speech? It's a really interesting question. Now, another dimension that is certainly related to the First Amendment and the fiber arts is the idea of censorship or gatekeeping. So fiber a lot of times is relegated to a decorative status. And Hanna Rugen, so this is the Norwegian weaver I was talking about, she totally exploded that mold when she started doing weavings that were portrayals of representative portrayals of fascist leaders that she was critiquing. So prior to her, mainly women, female artists would win these awards at national festivals for the crafts by doing really incredible geometric designs, maybe something a little bit William Morris-esque. And here Hannah Regan was portraying William Churchill, portraying Adolf Hitler, portraying Mussolini, and doing so in ways that were overtly political, or complaining about the capitalist system and its exploitation and exploitation of labor, and especially when it concerned farming and living off the land, which was what she did and that kind of thing. So, if we relegate something to being decorative, we can sort of speculate whether or not it's punch in its potential to express something that is politically a little bit more obvious or contentious is being, undermined somehow. If you label something as craft instead of art, that can also serve as a kind of censorship. If somebody were to say, oh, Hannah Regan, she's making these tapestries. Well, they're just decorative. They're just supposed to be hanging in someone's house. And then say that it doesn't really count as a political statement. It's, being censored by virtue of being labeled as something that is not, it's not really covered by, it doesn't fall under speech. It's an interesting concept. Can also deem knitted messages as acceptable or unacceptable based on the content. Now we can, knit words into our hats and our shirts and all that kind of stuff. And you can almost think of it as a way of asserting the kind of power of knitting, because it's sort of a hidden. It's like under the radar, flying under the radar type of protests. Interesting things to ponder. And again, some of these points I might come back to in a little more thoroughly. Here's another. So I cover a lot of slow fashion, and one point that maybe is worth pondering is the idea of knitting and fiber crafting as slow speech in a fast role, because and I think I have a friend who does embroidery, and some of her favorite topics are cuss words, and some people use embroidery as a way to create messages that have certain political potency. Well, you're not going to make that kind of thing in a day. You're not going to bang that out on a computer in half an hour and publish it all across the internet. So it's kind of a resistance to the speed of digital discourse, which can be refreshing. It can also frame things in a slightly different way that maybe can appeal or reach people in, maybe more effectively. I think it's worth thinking about, because we're bombarded all the time by messages, digital messages, social media posts, etc. And sometimes there's just so many of them that we just discount them. But if you encounter something that somebody's taken the care, like say you're at the county fair and you see someone has written a message into their quilt, and you're like, wait, what? I only expected to see some squares here. And then there's this, maybe some moral implication or something about religion or something about, a loss that somebody experienced, a personal expression, and you're kind of taken aback. It's like assigns a different quality to that message. The whole idea of slow speech. And maybe it could be also conceived as embodying like patience and persistence, which is a cool idea too. It's a message that you are really thinking hard about because you're taking a long time making that message. So it's not necessarily something that could be relegated to the status of a rage post or instantly retracted or something like that. It's, whoever knitted that message or sewed that message into their quilt or, whatever that voting rights fiber craft that I saw, they really meant it. And almost makes me want to take it more seriously. Another really cool exhibit I saw of fiber quilts was black and white quilts, had to do with civil rights movement. That was in St. Paul, and it was this whole series of black and white quilts that people had made that illustrated different points along the way of the civil rights movement in quilted form, and some of them did have written messages that were very potent political messages. And again, it reminds me of this whole idea of, slow speech, that whoever took the time to write that, they were really serious about it. That's a message that they really want to have it be out there because they spent so much time making it, crafting it. Now, another area that is kind of a whole different topic has to do with, ownership, like the right to create, intellectual freedom. There could be attempts to like restrict patterns. We look at the Norwegian hat pattern that people talk about how it was banned. And that's something that can kind of come into play when we're talking about artistic freedom. So the relationship between artistic freedom and freedom of speech is really interesting to think about. Pattern, like copyrights and stuff like that. There are also, apparently there's such a thing as open source knitting communities. I see a lot of people wanting to do like pattern exchanges. It reminds me of Vandana Shiva and the whole like seed exchange where people would collect things of value, which would have been seeds in this case in the agricultural economy, and patterns can function the same way. I mean, sometimes I look at a pattern and I'm like, that's probably been helping people survive for a long, long time. Like the 0815 mitzvah, the 0815 hat. Somebody pointed out to me the meaning of 0815, 0815. It just means run of the mill. And that's probably a pattern. I think it even says in the pattern that it's been around forever. But it's such a good pattern because, man, it really does keep your head warm. So that's the kind of thing where you think about intellectual property and ownership and stuff like that. But you also think about communal exchange and how that can play into this whole notion of, freedom of speech and freedom of sharing ideas and that kind of thing. And then I'm going to come to a final point for tonight. And if you want me to kind of like dig deeper, or if you've got some ideas on, share some comments on these topics, this is great. I just wanted to explore this whole notion because it's just so damn relevant. Fiber art is something that it's like art in general in many ways. It appeals to emotional registers that are often excluded from what some people might call serious political speech. It can be used to, like subtle persuasion, to move people in a more gentle kind of way. And that also falls under free speech, But I think one of the cool things about knitting and fiber crafting, sewing, is that, and it's something that I think we should emphasize as crafters, it invites empathy and compassion more than it does confrontation. So words can easily spiral out of control. I had one curious post, comment on my video about the Melt the Ice hat. And the person said, I would never knit something to spread hate. And I'm like, wait a minute, what does knitting these hats have to do with hate? Nothing, right? Because the whole point is raising money to protect immigrants. And also, again, to express our willingness to resist, our communal spirit, belonging together, our connections to the past. I mean, there's so many reasons to engage in that, collective act of knitting this historical cap. None of it has anything to do with hate. That's like, it's so easy to spew hatred on social media, but I really don't see knitting as a way of doing that. And that's a really big reason to nurture and protect these crafts, these, dare I say, feminine crafts. They're everybody's crafts, right? But they've always sort of been deemed, women's work. And I think I can probably join other women in asserting that there is something about giving birth that, for those of us who've done it, allows us easier access to cultivating compassion and empathy, as opposed to more forceful kinds of persuasion, emotions, etc. And I think there's a degree of biology behind that. It's only a degree, right? But in any case, I'd be curious what you think about some of these points. First Amendment protections as related to knitting, fiber arts, and I'll conclude with just to reiterate the latter point that I think fiber crafting, when you make stuff like this that's colorful, soft, a lot of times it's for protecting the body. I mean, gosh, you can even think of shrouds. That's just such a compassionate thing to make for a person who's passed. The fiber arts are really good at invoking some of the feelings that I dare say we ought to all be cultivating on a regular basis. Empathy, compassion, one that comes up at very poignant moments in the Christmas Carol movie, which is tenderness. So on that note, I'm going to keep working on my rainbow scarf. I'd love to know what you guys are working on and what your thoughts are on this topic, especially on this particular day with particular events happening that are purely disturbing. So everyone, stay safe. Have a really great weekend. Keep crafting, keep knitting, keep crocheting, and we'll talk soon. Ciao.